in listen-only mode.
All right, if we can go to the next slide. So during our time together today, we're going to start with approving the minutes from our meeting on February 25th, then transition into an overview of the published rates, along with the LTSS expansion timeline, reinforce key concepts around the development of rates, and walk through the FY22 rate changes. We then want to spend the rest of the meeting solidifying our FY23 and FY24 rate priority recommendations from this group. During the meeting, feedback will be limited to seated members. For members of the community attending today's meeting, we encourage you to use the comment feature to offer feedback. While responses may not be provided, all comments and feedback are important and will be reviewed. Next slide. As a reminder, the DDA Rate Review Advisory Group is a critical component of the DDA annual rate review process, and this process will align with other Medicaid rate reviews and will initiate an open structure to support in-depth reviews of rates, rate components, and policies impacting rate operationalization. Next slide. Members were sent an email with meeting minutes and the presentation deck from Emily Ornstein on Monday, March 7th. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the meeting minutes. Would a member like to second?
I'll second.
Okay, any discussion? Okay, so why don't we take a vote to approve the minutes that were distributed on March 7th. All in favor?
Aye.
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 And is there anyone opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. And with that, I will turn things over to Robert for some discussion of the LTSS timeline.
Miss Jennifer, Robert, real quick. Just can we give a shout out to today being World Down Syndrome Day? I mean, it's what we do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that, Christian. Thanks, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. So this is just a high-level overview of our expanded pilot transition timeline. A lot of work has occurred in preparation for the expanded providers going in. We recently, completed work on the April 1 rates, and they're queued up to go live on April 1. It's important to note that there has been no target date set for having all providers transitioned into LTSS Maryland, as Senate Bill 796 requires a piloting effort available to interested providers for at least 6 months. And the providers who will be part of the expanded pilot were selected out of 66 providers who expressed an interest in moving forward. We've had very phone conversations with them just to get a sense of what their readiness is. We shared feedback that we've been collecting from the early adopter group and some of the tools that we developed as a result of that with those providers as well. And these pilots will continue to inform our overall long-term transition timeline. This timeline also shows the annual 4% COLA increases, the first of which will occur this July. And then obviously July 1 of 2023, which will be fiscal year 24. We just wanted to illustrate that here on the timeline as well. If there are there any questions? That kind of concludes my overview of the timeline. Okay, if there are no
Hi,
questions.
Oh, this is Sharon Lewis. One quick question, Robert. I'm just wondering, do you guys know how many providers will be moving forward in the next phase of the pilot?
Yeah, yes, there's approximately 21 providers.
And are you guys, are there considerations in terms of ensuring that that's a representative sample of providers in terms of geography and types of services being delivered?
Let me take that question offline, Sharon, and discuss
Okay.
it with the team who worked on, you know, the selection criteria and get back to you on that.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, if there are no questions, I'd like to hand the mic back over to you, Jennifer, to kick off the overview of rate development discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So at this part of the meeting, we want to level set expectations for the rate development process as we work collaboratively to develop and review rates on an annual basis. Moving to this process will help us with the first three goals on the slide that you should see in front of you, which are to create a structured iterative process, maintain transparency of rate development, incorporate feedback from the rate review advisory group, providers, and other stakeholders. When making decisions as part of this process, we want to keep in mind that they are aligned with the last four bullets on this list, which are alignment with policy goals, informed by data or policy direction, standardized across like services, and developed independent of budget constraints. Now I'll hand it over to Leslie from Optimus, who will walk through an example of the decision-making process, noting that in the last meeting you wanted to learn more about the changes for FY22. So she'll also be taking you through the final changes that were made to the FY22 rates that are posted and available. Leslie?
Thanks, Jennifer. So like Jennifer was saying, last time we talked through the general rate buildup, and this time hearing the feedback, we want to talk through in more detail the decision-making process behind each component and how we build up the fully loaded rate. So one thing that's really important to note is that the wage is the basis for all of the rates. So once the wage has been set, all of the other components build off from those wages. So as we change the wages up or down, the other components will also be impacted. So once the wage is decided, we build up the components using relativity factors. This information comes from a variety of sources, most of them starting with the general ledgers that were collected. And then for the additional components, we factor in administrative costs and a service interruption adjustment. To get to the final rate, we'll take the fully loaded rate, which is the wage plus the wage-based components, general and administration, and a service interruption adjustment times the billable unit, which could be hours, days, 15-minute increments, etc. And then we'll multiply it by the staffing ratio. And then the final rate will come from the funding factor that we apply to that rate. So this is just a general overview of how everything fits together, and we'll go through in more detail in the next few slides. But any questions so far? Perfect.
I have a question, or I guess maybe a comment.
Sure.
So I recognize that you used the general ledgers of providers, obviously mostly who had been in PCIS 2 to set the LTSS rates. How do you account for the variance in service style, service definitions, and how services are provided as you transition from a prospective payment into a fee-for-service payment? How was that considered?
That's a really great question. So it's not all just based in general ledgers. So there's some pieces where, for instance, ERE, and we'll get into that, where we take that from the general ledger, but there are other components where the state has recognized that the transition into LTSS will take more than what is in the general ledgers. And so there's been the decision to make an enhanced adjustment to the rates. And so that's what we'll be talking through a very specific example for. Next, that's a great question. Carrie, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the first piece, like I said, is we have to decide the wage. And so we're just going to be walking through component by component, giving an example of the decision making during the rate development process. The example we're going to use is supported living with overnight supervision. And that's for the entire set of services. So for the wage selection, our wage data comes from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, or BLS, which is a massive national database of wages listed by various percentiles. So you can see here, they have information from like 10% of the national wage or average wage to all the way through to 90%. For our purposes, we're using region-specific wage data, and so we chose the Maryland-specific wages. Optimus took direction from DDA on which BLS codes to map to the specific services. So for supported living, we're using the BLS code 211093, which is social and human services. Based on initial feedback, we split the wages into two geographic areas, which we're calling the geographic region. That represents the DC and metro areas, and then the standard rates, which is the rest of state. For all of supported living, the state selected the 50th percentile, which gives us an $18.92 starting point for the geographic rate and a $16.50 average start for the standard rate. Because BLS statistics are a few years old, we want to trend that wage forward to the active rate cycle, so in this case, fiscal year 22, and take into account any policy decisions such as that 4% COLA increase to funding. And so with the aggregate increase of about 9.5% over the original BLS selected wage, we get an $18.06 starting point for the standard and a $20.71 starting point for the geographic differential rate. Okay, next slide.
Leslie, this is Maria. I have a question on the BLS. Is the BLS wage data, that's calendar 18, is that right, that you used for the 22 rates?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Is there a process by which you use a more recent BLS, or you versus the calendar 18? I'm just trying to understand what the process is for changing the BLS starting point versus just applying an additional year of trend.
So I believe when we do a rate rebase year, we'll be looking to update the the information we use as a starting point. And at that point, I believe we would start to, we would be using the most recent available BLS data.
Okay. And then can you speak to how you develop the 9.5% trend then if it's calendar 18?
Yes, so we used Cpi Trend, which is the consumer price index, to develop the I'm trying to remember the numbers off the top of my head, I apologize.
I think it was 5% and then 4.5%, but I wasn't sure where those came from.
Yeah, so we just used that over the years, and then we applied the 4% COLA increase that was passed by the legislation to get to the total of 9.5%. Carrie, I think you're no longer sharing the slides.
Yes, my apologies. I had something shut down in Google, so just give me 1 minute to reopen Google again and I'll reshare.
Okay, no worries.
Leslie, it's Laura. So while Carrie's doing that, so just to be clear, the 9.5% isn't CPI, it's the rate increase, correct?
Yeah, this is Chris. I can just speak to that too. Some of that came from CPI and some of that came from the cost of living increase that was put in place by the state. So it's a combination of those two things to get to the contract period or the rate period.
Okay, well then that triggers another question because the rate increase is 9.5%. So I'm not sure I quite understand how it could be a mix then.
Essentially, it breaks down to what years had which inflationary pieces. So I believe the most recent year has the 4% cost of living, and then prior to that is the CPI figures. So it's kind of done 1 year at a time. We could work to pull up those specific numbers if that's helpful to the group.
But if that's the case, then where is it? And you are applying a rate increase, you're applying the 4%, then where would the 5.5% that was also applied this year be?
Yeah, so this is Robert. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So Laura, this the LTSS rates, those rates in LTSS did not get the 5.5% ARPA. So this 9.5% inflationary factor is only accounting for the difference in the the CPI percentage and then the 22 COLA.
Okay, it would just be, then I think it would be helpful to see that, we don't do it right this second, I guess, but to see that breakdown would be helpful.
Yeah, we can make note of that and make sure to clarify next time. Were there any other questions on the BLS wage? Great. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so like I said, once we have our starting point, which is the wage, we want to relate all of the other components to that wage. And so as the wage goes up or down, so will the other components. From after the wage selection has been made, based on policy and feedback, we wanted to see whether it was still appropriate to take the percentage in the general ledgers. And depending on the service and policy goals, DDA either selected the relative percentiles that we calculated from the general ledgers or an enhanced calculation, like I've said. Just for instance, in some services, DDA elected to take 125% or 150% of what was showing in the general ledgers. And this is indicated by the source column within the rate models that have been shared. And so the 4 components on this slide were all derived from general ledgers when it comes to supported living with overnight. The 4 components are employee-related expenses, which is ERE. This was assumed to be similar across all services. And so we aggregated all of the general ledgers and came out to be 30.5% of the compared to the wages. For facility component, room and board is not eligible for residential services per CMS, and so that's coming in as a 0%. Program support is, we assumed that they were distinct by service category, and so for program support, we only aggregated residential general ledgers to get a 25.5% relative percentage to the wage costs. So this would be different in other services such as day or support services. Similar story for transportation. We assumed that, again, this would be distinct by service category. And so when we aggregated the residential general ledgers, we saw a 6.5% relative cost to the wage costs. Next slide, please.
Can we have access to the non-residential in those two situations so we can see what those percentages are at some point?
Yes, so that should all be in the rate models that have been put out. That's what I was referring to. In the rate model, there's columns after each component called the source, labeled source, and that's exactly where all those policy decisions are laid out.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So one component that varies drastically from what was showing in the general ledgers is the training. DDA decided to enhance this component by taking into account the training, the initial and ongoing training requirements for all of the various roles that are matched to the services. So on screen are the training listed and which roles they apply to. The total number of hours for each of these roles were factored into the cost. The top table shows all of the requirements for DSPs to comply with the requirements. And then the bottom table shows specific trainings for specific roles. So not all of the bottom trainings apply to every role. Next slide, please.
Can you explain how the DSP2, what data they used when they created the DSP2 training?
I don't know if anyone from DDA would like to step in as a...
Sure, I'll try to help here. This is Rhonda Workman. Good afternoon, everybody. Karen, I believe we used the information that when we were working with you related to the tiers and the DSP2, but we can go back and confirm that.
Okay, we have some good data on that, as does Maryland Department of Labor. So we have some decent data on that for accuracy.
Great, thank you.
It's Laura. Just a quick question. Can somebody speak to the assumptions around the time for the training?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If we go to the next slide, that's where we'll have it laid out. Perfect, thank you. So DDA did factor in more than just the required training hours because we recognize that the accounting for the cost of training hours alone may not be enough to cover the true costs of training. So there are some cost differences for full-time versus part-time employees. We saw that there was about a 2/3 split between full-time and part-time employees. We wanted to also account for tenured staff who would do ongoing trainings versus new staff that would need all of the trainings. Optimus and DDA also took into account turnover rates that we saw in coverage while staff is out for training. And so those are the types of things that we took into account. So for the initial and ongoing training, we had 63 hours in total for a DSP1, and then 10 ongoing hours. The role that was matched to supported living with overnight was DSP1, and so that's the example that's on the board, but this was taken into consideration for all of the roles that were matched with the various services. And so for a DSP1, we built in 8% relativity to the wages for training. Did that answer your question, Laura?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. Were there any other questions on training?
Leslie, can you bounce back one screen for me?
Sure.
When we look at the training that's required, and I guess just my opinion here, one thing that seems to be absent, I know we've been down this path before and I've mentioned it, is the individualized training that's required for staff to serve the individuals that they're assigned to on their caseload. You know, we talk about small group and large groups and the different house sizes. That level of training and that amount of time invested into that from the provider perspective is really, in my opinion, not addressed here.
Chris, this is Rhonda. That's a great question. And I think on the chart, it shows specific person, specific training. So that was considered and a component of that.
Okay, thank you, Rhonda. I see that now. My apologies.
If there are no other questions on training, we can move to the next slide. So these are the last pieces of building up the rate. Based on the general ledgers, the general and administrative costs were coming in at about 10.3% of the relative wage. Again, DDA made the policy decision to bump G&A up to 12% to account for the added costs of transitioning and operationalizing the new system. There's one more adjustment that we've included, which is the service interruption adjustment. Just to account for closures due to unforeseen circumstances such as weather or other like circumstances. The closure refers to day settings, but DDA knows that when there's closures in day setting, residential services are also impacted, so which is why there's a service adjustment built in for residential services. Optimus collected 3 years of data around the closures. And so in the 1,096 days of services that we looked at, we saw that there were 26 closures, which is approximately 2.4% that we applied to the rate. Next slide. So the last piece determining the final unit cost per rate is figuring out the staffing ratio and billable units. So we're just talking about residential hours here, but for supported living, the staffing depends on the size of the setting. For a 2-person setting, the DDA has determined that there needs to be 1 staff on average. The billable units for supported living is hours specifically, so the number of on-site staff hours needed to run that residential setting. The hours assumption is based on a staffing model, which was developed using policy requirements and provider feedback. So in here, we've assumed this is just for a 2-person home with overnight. We've assumed that during the weekday, there's about 18 daily hours over 5 days, which gives us 90. And then 24 daily hours over 2 weekend days, which is 48 hours. And so our base hour subtotal is 138 hours. In addition, DDA has included flex hours that go above the base hours to support individualized schedules and needs without needing to seek the additional dedicated hours. We built in 5 hours daily for the weekday, and then 8 hours daily for the weekend, which gets us to 41 flex hours. So for a 2-person home, we've totaled 179 hours in, and to get the rate per home, we will take those hours and divide by 7 to get on average 25.6 hours per day per home. And this is not a prescriptive set of hours. This is just how we're going to use the total hours per week to get to a daily rate. Any questions?
I have a question about the prescriptive hours. I appreciate you saying that. One of our concerns, I think, often as providers is that when the Office of Healthcare Quality gets a hold of this, they tend to use anything that's got hard data on it to do utilization or review plans. Is this only for the financial side and it will not impact the program side?
That's a great, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Sure, sorry. So Karen, good question. You know, what we want to do is make sure that we're supporting people's needs. So there's 179 hours for the week to support people's needs. They don't all have to be used, the 179, because it's based on individualized schedules. And so what we'll do is work to make sure that that communication and that guidance for OHCQ is provided, so that that's what they're looking at in terms of any reviews that they're doing for their work.
Thank you.
I had a question. I do think there's a lot of concern about how this plays out long term in terms of audits. So I need to say that. And then I had a question about, and I don't know if it's coming up on a future slide or not, but how the flex hours relate to or impact dedicated hours.
Hey, Laura, this is Patricia. Do you mean like as far as when they first requested, or when they have to use the base hours before they can request the dedicated hours?
The latter. So what impact will, what would need to be, I know you said they wouldn't need to be used in, you know, you wouldn't have to show that they were being provided, but where someone is known to need dedicated hours, you know, how will the flex hours play into that calculation?
So there's a couple of things that we can look at it. We want to go back to that whole personal planning process, and we really want the base hours to cover what a person would need within their 24-hour supports within the home, right? And so that's how we would want the base flex hours to be used for anybody within the house to do that. And then the dedicated hours would come on in based on individualized support needs, whether for somebody needed individual support to get into the community due to their behavior supports or individualized supports. Rhonda, do you want to add to that?
Sure. You know, good question, Laura. So again, we're trying to build in the flexibility for individualized schedules, support our community settings, integration strategies, and so that's there. So there's a number of hours built in there that the provider can use based on people's needs. So they're not specific to a specific person, but there's hours in there that's going to support more than just one staffing, but flexible based on those needs. If those hours are not enough to support, the residents in that home, then you can, look for the dedicated hours to support them. Some individuals may need a 2-to-1, so that would be, that dedicated 2-to-1 supports. But we were really hoping that by providing these flexible hours in there, it'll support more individualized schedule and then therefore decrease the need to be seeking dedicated supports and all that kind of tracking. But really wanted to have that flexibility in there for people's needs. And again, open to providing additional guidance in our policies and information.
Right. So I think the concept of flex hours is really good. And, I think it's great to have, an option for people to not, who live together, not having to all do the same thing. I guess my question is, if we know for sure that someone needs dedicated supports, if you have to use the flex hours before you can be approved for dedicated hours, then that has the potential to defeat the purpose in the home, since the flex hours are for a home. So that's
right.
why I'm trying to get at that.
Yeah, so just a couple things related to that. We know that some providers, our early adopters and other providers, may have already put in for dedicated hours based on the previous hours that were associated with the homes. We do not want to revise PCPs to change that based on the new rates that came up and the hours associated with them. So basically what we would be saying then is, we can authorize those dedicated hours And then the provider then, as per the guidance about provider billing documentation, would be keeping their timesheets and information about what they're using. But we're happy to authorize those hours, and then the provider can access those if they need those hours to support people in the home, that these flexible hours are not meeting people's needs. So we will not authorize. We're happy to look at that and provide those additional hours, based on the policy standard, so that they're there and available to access if needed.
Okay, so just for complete clarity, would you have to demonstrate that you have provided all of the flex hours in the home before you would be able to tap into dedicated hours?
So great question, Laura. And I think that that's not a yes or no answer, because each home and in situation is going to be different. For instance, someone may need a 2-to-1, right, versus a 1-to-1 or just general staffing level. So what we're saying is you will be documenting as per the billing guidance. You take timesheets, you have notes about what supports are being provided to people. So that's what providers are doing currently. And so you would utilize those flexible hours to address people's needs. And then if you needed to use dedicated hours, you would be using those dedicated hours, billing and documenting those needs too.
This is Donna. I guess, I mean, it still feels very confusing. And so if I could give another example, I understand the flexible hours, which is wonderful. We're all looking forward to those. So you have a house that has 3 residents in the home, and they need to share those hours to do things that are going to meet their needs, flexible throughout the week and the weekend. But let's just say one of those participants absolutely has dedicated hours that are needed specifically for them on a regular basis. I would not imagine you would be looking to use any of those flex hours for that particular person, because the reason for the need is very different. Is that correct?
Well, I think, again, it's an individual person we're talking about, and their needs are going to change and vary, right? And we know that some people are very active in their community, and will maybe even utilize more than what these flexible hours are, and may need additional hours to support their community integration. Some people may need dedicated hours because of medical or behavioral concerns that are documented in their behavior plan or their nursing care plan. The staffing model, right, to meet those people's individuals' needs and the supports and the training may vary based on the person. Some may be fine with the DSP1 level, right? So all those things you have to kind of think about and consider, and then the additional staffing that would be needed. So there could be scenarios where the flexible hours are meeting both the people with dedicated needs and the people in the home. There could be situations where you have the base staffing hours that we've showed here on the screen, plus another staff to do flexible hours, plus you made another staff to do dedicated 1-to-1 because of a medical or behavioral concern. So it's really going to be based individual, based on the person, and then that home and the supports that are provided collectively as you look at that unit.
So based on that, it does sound like for the most part, you are going to have to show use of these flex hours before you have additional ongoing add-on hours.
The hours will be authorized, and if you need to access them, then you would access them.
Ron, I think really what we're talking about, though, is on the back end of this whole equation, the fact that you're going to authorize them is fantastic. It gives that flexibility in moving forward. Where the rubber meets the road is when we're audited, are we going to need to show that we have consumed all of the flex hours for that home before we are allowed to bill any dedicated hours?
I would say, Robert, feel free to jump in here from that perspective, but I would say that the state is providing a rate that provides a level of hours of supports that are needed there based on individual needs. You would be able to put in your files and documentation if people needed a 2-to-1 or such. We know through the guidance on provider billing documentation that you guys are recording timesheets and notes related to the supports that you're providing to an individual or individuals in the home. So you'll already have that documentation there to support any follow-up or reviews that would be conducted.
I still think we're a pretty significant gray area here from the providers being able to actually apply this when they're requesting the funding, actually staffing it, and then being able to have the documentation and justification on the back end. We've been struggling with this concept of the dedicated hours of when we can access them, when we can't access them for several years as part of this process. And I just think the more gray the area is, the more issues we're going to have, the more providers going to be caught up in some type of an audit issue on the back end.
Well,
Yeah, these are all great questions. And I just want to say that we are currently, updating our billing guidelines to reflect the policy decisions that are behind the April 1 rates. And so these are all good questions. And I'm glad that you all were able to point out some of what you identify as gray areas. So we'll make sure that we provide that clarity with the updated documentation. But I want to make sure that we kind of stick to the agenda because I know we have a lot to cover. And this is a very, very interesting topic here because it talks about the rate development process. So I think it's important that Leslie get to spend the amount of time necessary to make sure that, folks have a general understanding of the BRIC methodology. So Leslie.
Robert, could I mention one more thing, please? Just
Sure,
in reference
absolutely.
to the flex hours, the impact tool. I don't know that there was clear guidance on the fact that we were to account for flex hours as a part of what we submitted as request for dedicated in that equation. How does that change or this change here affect the results of the impact tool?
You're referring to the fact this was a change that happened after November, and so that you're thinking that folks may have applied the policy erroneously or didn't have any clarity around how to apply it.
Correct. I mean, if I was doing a projection, I would have started to factor in dedicated hours after I had consumed the 138 base, not taking into consideration the 41 flex hours. And maybe some providers did it differently and accounted for that, but I'm going to bet to say that probably not everybody did. Which means your impact tool projections are going to be significantly higher because you've now got 41 hours of dedicated that I'd asked for thinking I'm getting, and now they're funded in the rate itself. So that's a pretty significant change.
yeah, I don't think the flex hours, I thought they were something new actually since that. I know Robert wants to move forward. Can I just say, I really recommend that we flag this as something that needs some significant discussion moving forward, because I think that even in this discussion, I feel like I heard different interpretations, and I think the flexibility is great, but on the front end of authorization and on the back end of auditing, we're going to see some significant issues.
So I think Robert's suggestion to kind of take this feedback and make sure it's reflected in the upcoming billing guidance is a good one. So I would ask DDA to take that back. At the same time, I think, as Robert also said, the purpose of this is an illustration. So I'd like us to kind of continue with that illustration, and also, Laura, to your point, if there is an aspect of this that needs to be analyzed for further changes in the future, we can certainly consider that as well.
Yeah, I think this going straight to policy stat would personally make me really nervous without some more discussion in light of the complexity of what we've talked about. So thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. So here is the complete buildup of the supported living with overnight supervision. Again, this is just an example, but this rate will be specific to the 2-person home with overnight standard rate. The components are the same for the geographic and standard rates. The only difference here, as we said, is the starting wage, which impacts the dollars for the other components. But we start out with the BLS code that we've talked about at the 50th percentile, which gets us the $16.50. Applying the inflation percentage and the 4% COLA, we get to a starting wage of $18.06. And so from here, all the other components will be derived from that number. So for instance, ERE, we talked about, was a 30.5% for this service. And so we take 30.5% times the $18, we'll get $5.51. Facility, there is none for supported living or any residential services. For program support, you'll see under the source column, we took the residential relative percentage to get $4.61. The training, the DSP1 was matched to the service. Again, for transportation, we're taking residential specific percentiles to get the $1.17. And so we get to a subtotal of $30.79. We then apply the G&A piece, which is the 12%, and then the service adjustment, 2.4% we talked about, to get to a fully loaded rate of $35.82. To get the billable rate, we're going to then take the units and the staffing assumptions and to multiply by the fully loaded rate. And so for residential or supported living, the billable unit is 1 day. And just like in the last slide, we talked about an estimated 25.6 hours per day. And again, this is not a prescriptive model. This is just what we've built in from that 179 hours to get to that billable rate. And in a 2-person home, our staffing assumption is 1 staff for 2 people, which gets us a 0.5 ratio. So multiplying the $35 times the 25 hours times the 0.5 staffing ratio, we get $458.03 as the billable rate per day for a supported living 2-person home with overnight. Any questions on how all of that comes together? So that's a lot of information.
This is Chris. I actually do have a go ahead.
So how did you decide the percentages, the funding level adjustments? Because I know some are funded at higher and some are lower. Why is this particular one at 83 and others at a different rate?
So I can start. We took the services and grouped them together, and so all of the residential services are being funded at 83%. The day services are being funded at 90%, and then the supported services are being funded at 100%. And then I'll let DDA speak to how those percentages were decided.
Sure. So, you know, as you all have, most of you have seen an illustration of the glide path that we've been, you know, kind of using, right? And so in order to maintain that glide path, so that, you know, when the ARPA funds run out, you all as providers don't face the financial cliff, we have to fund at least, I think it's might be 87, a blended rate of 87 or 88% of the rates. And so when that, so your question is how did we make the decision to only fund 83% of residential and 90% of meaningful day services, for example? So as you all know, the residential accounts for the largest portion of the DDA budget. And so when you look at that proportionally and also making sure that the rates are adequate to cover all of the services, then you know, residential as a category would be funded at a lower percentage to allow us to make sure that, you know, we're funding enough a meaningful day and the other services to ensure that the rate is adequate. No, that was a very high level kind of explanation.
Can I ask a question? And this goes to the sort of fixed versus variable, I think, which we talked a lot about in DayHab, but I'm just, can you just remind me that transportation and program support, I guess, that sort of being tied to the staffing. I mean, clearly BLS, ERE, and training all make sense to tie to the staff ratio, but program support and transportation seems like it wouldn't.
So, we're actually going to walk through an example about DayHab in just a minute, where we kind of talk about that specifically. So maybe we can just put a pin in that question for now and come back to it in a couple minutes, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks.
Can I ask another question on the spreadsheet that we're looking at right now? I'm just trying to make sure I understand this methodology. When you get to a subtotal of $30.79, and then you have 12% policy decision of $4.20, that's 12% of what? Because it's not 12% of $30.79.
That's a really great question and observation there. So we apply G&A and the service adjustment a little differently. We want to apply it as the total of the rate. And so the 12% is referring to 12% of the fully loaded rate. And so the $4.20 is 12% of the $35.82.
Okay, so we're backing, okay. And the same thing with the 2.4%?
That's correct.
Okay.
Greg, in the past, we refer to those as percentage of premium or percentage of the total rate adjustments. The ones up above are all based off of percentage of the BLS wage.
Okay. Thank you.
Just to split hairs a little bit more, I think the 12% is exactly what Steve was talking about, where we gross that up to get to kind of a final rate, and then the service adjustment is a percentage of that grossed one. So essentially, if you take 12%, what's needed, to get $30.79 to about just under $35, and then you multiply that by an additional 2.4%. That's how those calculations work. So the 12% is a gross up, and then the 2.4% is on top of everything that's done at that point.
Got it.
Any other questions on this example rate buildup? Great. I did want to make one final comment, which is, as you've seen, up until the billable rate line, all of our rates we set regardless of budget, and we're setting it based on the total cost that's necessary for the service. And then the final funded rate is where the budget constraints come in. All right, next slide. So some of the feedback we heard from last time is that the changes that are made up to this fiscal 22 rates that are being shared April have not been very clear. And so we're bringing back the high level summary, but we have the summarized document. Carrie, I'm not sure if you're able to flip it.
Leslie, say that again.
Can we go over to the detailed document of the changes?
I can. Just give me a second, okay? I'm gonna have to pull it up, so give me 1 minute.
So the document's going to outline in detail what the changes are and the services that were impacted, and it'll be categorized by what you see in the first column, wages, review for consistency, and etc.
That's something, I'm not sure if that's been shared yet, but I believe the intent is to have that shared if it hasn't been yet. So that you guys have a little more time to digest it than just looking at a slide on the fly.
Awesome. So you can see here, again, it's split out by those major categories of changes that we saw on the slide. So we have the wages, review for consistency, the budget policy, transportation, residential hours, the brick to unit conversion, and then to the right, the standard rest of state wage calculation. And listed underneath is just a description of all the changes that were made at a higher level, but a little bit more detailed than what was on the slide, and then all of the services that were impacted by those changes.
Can we scroll to the left just a little more? I think maybe column B has a little bit of a description, yep, of what's in each row there to help organize this a little bit.
I don't know if anybody else see that. It's way too small on my screen.
Yeah, and as Chris was saying, the intention is to send this out so that everybody here has the opportunity to review in more detail, because this is a lot of text and we don't expect you to have all of the time here to review it.
So just like Leslie's saying, when we're talking about wages being changed, for example, in that first one, the percentile wage selections were reviewed for consistency and some were adjusted. And then specific to the April 22 rates, what was changed was the CDS group 1 to 4 base wage. And then the rows below that are the services that were potentially reviewed or impacted by that change. So that's kind of how you'd interpret this information as you go through and digest a little bit.
Chris, do you know when we'll receive this worksheet?
I'm not sure if that's something that DDA may be able to speak to.
Sure. By the end of the day, we'll have this over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Robert.
Carrie, I flipped control back over to you.
Thanks, Robert. Let me know if folks can see that again. Yep, great, thanks. I'll put it in present mode.
And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to Chris, who's going to speak to some of the priorities and examples of what we're moving towards in this newer cycle.
Leslie, could you guys back up one slide real quick? I just have a quick question on that last slide. And Chris, you mentioned this, the brick to unit conversion. Is that something you're getting ready to discuss now?
Yes, in just a minute. Okay. We'll get there.
All right, then you don't need to go back.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I apologize, but I think you can see that it's not loading again. So I'm just going to need another minute to probably go back out and come back in.
Okay, no problem. So just to give you guys kind of the context where we've kind of gotten to so far, I think Leslie wanted to walk through and provide a little bit more context around how any given rate might be developed, what those data sources are, what kind of adjustments might be made, and then how all the pieces come together. And the reason for that was we wanted to give you guys a foundation to work from when we're looking at, what are some of the things that the RRAG or various stakeholders have provided feedback on, and how can we work to address those things? What kind of levers, what might we be able to pull? So the next slide that we're going to come up on is something that essentially you guys had seen before. It's just a review of stakeholder interests and priorities. So looking at things like the transportation components that are in the rates, attendance issues like no-shows and cancellations, the relationship between wages and staff turnover, the daily staff hour assumptions. We kind of had a little bit more discussion around that today with those staffing models plus the flex hours, and it sounds like there's a lot of gray area still there that needs some clarity and some additional discussion. Looking at revenue and expenses for each group home size, and I think that's a similar thing for the DayHab that we've been hearing. Looking at whether the rates sufficiently consider all the non-billable staff time, comparison the policies for group sizes for day services to the operational needs. Looking at those fixed and variable costs, that's come up a couple times so far. Looking at if the rates appropriately address the varying needs among members, if there's different levels of acuity. We can go on to the next slide for this. Looking at difficulties in transitioning to a new system, I think that was something that Leslie mentioned. We were seeing a 10.3% load for general and administrative costs in the general ledgers, but based on DDA's input, that's been bumped up to a 12% assumption to try to account in some way for some of the shifting needs there, but that may or may not be appropriate. That's kind of something that we're open to discussing. And then the details of the employment services rate development, I think, is something that some folks had specific questions around. So those were some issues that we had kind of talked about so far. Leslie showed us some of the things for fiscal year 22. So what we really wanted to do was move forward in fiscal year 23. So we'll be coming up live in July, and there's not a whole lot of time before that. So we really wanted to prioritize and help focus on something that will help us drive to making any changes we think are necessary. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next slide. And what we have done here is we are looking at essentially the same kind of buildup for Leslie had shared for the supported living, I believe. This one is specific to DayHab small group in the standard rate. So you can see if we're thinking about what we might want to address here, there's all those different components. We've got that BLS wage, we've got the inflation, the ERE, there's things like the GNA and the service adjustment, the billable unit. Some things we've kind of talked about are maybe the staffing ratio, the staff per unit, and we've got that funding level adjustment. So there's lots of different pieces here. And if we hear feedback that says, hey, we might be missing the mark on DayHab small group, that's good, that gives us something to look at, but what we need to do is try to identify, which of these pieces are we missing, or is somehow this entire structure kind of missing the mark? So we'll walk through this as an example because we had heard this from a few different providers. I don't think we necessarily got a consensus last time, so we're just going with this based on what we've heard from a variety of sources as an example. And then after walking through this example, I wanted to have a discussion and see, what you all think about some of the approaches we've laid out, as well as whether or not this is a priority or if there are other priorities we should look at first. So with that in mind, let's walk on to the next slide. This will be a first example for day habilitation. And so if you look kind of at the top there, we have for data, we have the existing assumptions we've walked through a little bit. On that last slide, I don't think I got through all the details there, but for DayHab, like Leslie had mentioned, that was something where we looked at general ledgers. That was increased to 125% of the general ledgers. And then, based on additional feedback, that was something where we removed the bottom quartile of data to further increase that transportation percentage. But, that is something where there might still be a disconnect from the experience for providers. The aim here is really to try to get it most accurate as possible. So what we could do, this is again an example of how we're thinking through this process, if transportation or day hab seems like maybe the first target area or something that's most critical here, we could look at data requests like we have in the bottom there, or we ask for providers, dates, you know, the start time to the drop off in minutes, how much billable time for day hab happens during the day, and then the pickup time to the end, the total employee travel time, and we can kind of compare those two things to see if the percentages that we've built in are really on the mark, or if they've missed the mark, or what other considerations may need to be made. Additionally, on that third row for the top, you could look at updated transportation equipment or maintenance costs and wages and see how those things play together. And we could potentially look at, you know, both of those sources of data and combining those to see if we're really getting an accurate picture of what transportation would cost. So this is just one way that we would consider, looking at revising some of the assumptions, some of the components that go into that day hab rate.
Chris, this is Scott. Can I interrupt you?
Sure.
Just looking at that bottom line, you know, start time, drop off, et cetera, and 12%, I think was what I heard you say. Can you run an example of how that math would work? Start time, let's say the start time that is a total of an hour of start time and 6 hours of billable time. You know, what percentage would that be? I'm kind of curious to see how you get 12% out of that.
Sure. So the 12% is actually for the G&A component. What we had in place for day hab at the moment, I believe, is 28.7%. So that is a bit above, but yes, essentially that's the idea there, that we'd be looking at, you know, in a given day, how many hours of billable time versus that transportation time, and doing kind of that comparison of transportation time, essentially kind of like the numerator versus billable time, essentially as the denominator. And there may be some tweaks that are needed there, but that's essentially the process that we would be looking at. So this is something we had conversations around in the past a little bit. So this is information that, you know, certainly could be useful. Some of the potential issues are that this may be burdensome or time consuming for providers to share with us, which might make the timeline tight in terms of making an adjustment before July, before the fiscal year 23 goes live. So that's kind of a consideration. We wanted to, you know, bring that up with you guys. We're all kind of on the same page here, on the same team, that we're trying to get these rates as accurate as possible. And we face those same constraints where, you know, we want to have good data to work from, and we hear that you guys also want to have good data to work from, but we face that kind of same time constraint or availability of data constraint. So that's why I wanted to, you know, share with you all and see what the thought process is here. But yeah, if I don't know if that answers your question. If so, we can probably move on to the next one. If not, we can spend a little more time here.
Sure, no, that answered the question. Go ahead.
What? Oh, Chris, a couple of things. If you can just go back for a second. I think, you know, a couple of things in terms of the starting point for the data and where we are now in terms of data. Can you remind me the ledgers? I have in my head the ledgers, the original ledger data was from 2014. Is that correct? Do you happen to remember?
I'm not sure. I want to say it was mostly between 2014 and 2016, but I'd have to double check. But yeah, it's certainly around that period.
So they were, because the JVGA began in 2015. So my memory is that they pulled 14 ledgers, which if we didn't have a pandemic, that's a separate issue. What day hab programs looked like in 14 versus what they looked like the day, you know, February of 2020 before the pandemic started, is pretty significant for most providers, because, you know, their transportation costs looked very different, their staffing looked very different. So that kind of raises some issues with the day hab rates. And I think the original tech work group worked with DDA to try and get at some of that through some policy decisions, because I think there was an acknowledgement that that 14 construct was really stale in light of the community rule. And in terms of looking at the current data collection and the concern you expressed about it being onersome or perhaps taking too much time, I would say, we now are in a situation where the day hub programs are not all up and running. Probably most of them are not fully operational the way they were. I think we know that. So that would make data collection difficult. But I guess I would say, does it make sense to, much like the way other decisions have been made based on a subset of data or policy decisions, whether it makes sense to look at, a way to have a better understanding of what is needed, but that doesn't set this really high bar of needing data from every provider.
Sure. Yeah, I think we're on the same page with you. Understanding that there are differences between the base data collection period and that rate implementation time period. Those are things that should be addressed if there's a change there. And so what we need to understand is, to what degree is that something that should be changed, and how would we go about that? So I think you're hitting the same marks that we're understanding there, where it may be difficult to or impossible to collect this from all DAHAB providers, but maybe a subset that is representative might be a starting point to work with. So we have a couple options here of things that we are kind of throwing out there to consider. It might be helpful to go through the next couple slides, and then we have kind of an area for discussion to look at, is transportation where we really want to focus? Is that one of the things that we want to focus on in addition to other things? And if we did want to do transportation, is this the kind of information we'd want to collect, or how might we want to change that?
Can I just say one more thing? I think we kind of breezed past it, but I do think the fixed versus variable costs is really key to the DAHAB rate, and I do think we need to look at that again.
Yep, yeah, that's coming up in one or two more slides. So we'll get there for sure. So I think we're probably ready to move on to the next slide here. And so this one is an example where we've been hearing from some providers. I think for CDS group sizes, we were hearing pretty consistently that although the group size was originally defined as 2 to 4 individuals, what their experience now is that they're usually serving 1 to 2 individuals at a time. And so that's something where DDA said, we hear that feedback, so we're going to change the definition to 1 to 4 individuals, and we'd look at changing that staff ratio down to a 1 to 1.5, 1 staff for an average of 1.5 individuals receiving the service, because that was relatively consistent feedback. We don't yet have very consistent feedback around a small group. So here's an example. What's built into the modeling as it exists is that we have a small group, and the average staff ratio that's assumed 1 staff per 3 individuals, or that 0.33 ratio. So on the far right, if we look at those red numbers, and we see that maybe the distribution is a little bit different, and maybe it's a little bit more heavily weighted towards smaller group sizes like we saw in CDS, then maybe our staff ratio should really be assuming, for example, again, this is all just a mock example, 1 staff to 2.5 individuals on average, which would take our staff ratio from 0.33 to 0.4, and that would give us roughly a 20% increase that might be warranted in the rates. So a couple pieces to keep in mind with this. We don't have that information presently. We're hoping that we can kind of glean that when we look at the provider impact tools, which is something that Hilltop is working through and will be discussing with us shortly. So we'll see what we can glean from that information. If that's not sufficient, or if we have other questions, that might be something just like transportation, where we need to kind of send out some surveys, and maybe that isn't as detailed or complicated as transportation, but that's something that hopefully would be able to get us a similar look here. So if we're thinking that, you know, these group sizes have really shifted and that's a focus area, this is one way that we would potentially make an adjustment to the rate, is by trying to identify the data that we're able to, you know, map to what the expected costs look like. I will also throw out there that there are budgetary constraints. I know there are some discussions going through the budgetary process right now, but essentially we have to keep considerations in mind for how any rate increases might impact the budget. And so that might be further questions as we get more information from the budgetary process, but that's just something to keep in mind as we consider this. So any questions, comments, thoughts on the staff ratio?
Let me just say one thing. Oh, actually, I just want to say, I want to speak because I'm sure a lot of people listening are concerned when they heard you say, you know, we need to look at the budget constraints. Of course, we understand the department has budget constraints, but I think folks would feel that one service should not bear the brunt of that concern.
Right, absolutely. And yeah, the intent here isn't to say that DAHAB is kind of stuck, but if DAHAB is adjusted, there may be other considerations needed. Maybe there's more funding that can become available. Maybe we need to revisit other assumptions elsewhere and see if there's some funding available. But the intent there is just to keep in mind that there are constraints on this. And as we, you know, progress a little bit further, we can understand what those constraints are a little bit better so that we can find what solution works best.
And this is Maria. I have just a clarifying question. I mean, this is an example of small group 2 to 5, but you have a group of 1. Is that why do you have a group of 1? I guess in this example for a 2 to 5, is that just an error, or is there a reason why you'd have sometimes one person in a group of 2 to 5?
Sure. This is Rhonda.
Go ahead.
Chris, would you like us to answer that?
Sure.
Sure. So, you know, there are small groups and large groups. We have small groups in CDS and DAHAB too. And so really you could have a group of 2 to 5, right? But let's say that some individuals decide not to participate in the group during the day, and it may end up being that the group is really only one person that goes out during the day. So technically there could be a group of technically from 1 to 5 where only one person is participating during the day, and that wouldn't be a situation where a person needed that 1-to-1. You know, DAHAB 1-to-1, which is designated for people with, you know, medical and behavioral needs and supports, as noted in the waiver program. So there could be someone who is in a small group that is the only person going out that day. Other people are on vacation, sick, don't want to participate or whatever. So the group size could technically be at a 1.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. And I'll just reiterate to throw on top of that, the CDS was an example where it was defined as a group size of 2 to 4. And based on feedback, DDA changed that definition to a group size of 1 to 4. And that could be a similar process that, you know, maybe makes sense for DAHAB small group.
Right, and then in that case, because CDS, the policy changed, I think it makes sense to make sure that that's reviewed, this relationship is reviewed to make sure that that ratio is appropriate.
So just wanted to clarify that the actual assumption for that change, not the actual definition of the service, just to be very clear.
And then I guess the other thing is just to clarify that it's not an assumed staff ratio. These are group sizes up to, you know, these numbers based on people with similar interests, wanting to do similar activities kind of thing. These are not mandated staff ratios.
Chris, is this the slide where we want to talk about the fixed versus variable with the staffing ratio component?
That's the next slide that we have.
Okay.
Just real quick for clarification, Patricia, you mentioned the definition for CDS. So without having it in front of me, is it specifically say 1 to 5 or does it say 2 to 5?
For CDS, we have up to 4 people.
It just says up to. Okay.
Up to, you know, up to 4 people, and that's why we have the various 1, 2, 3, 4, because you know not everybody goes always in a group, and that's why, as Rhonda described it, the 1 person or the 2 person.
Okay.
Great question.
All right, so we looked at transportation as a potential lever to, you know, address for the DAHAB rates. Another one we looked at here is that staffing ratio assumption. Maybe that's a lever that needs to be adjusted to better match the expected, you know, the experience that we're expecting the providers to have. And so if we move to the next slide, we'll look at a third option. And the idea here, again, is we're looking at 3 options that could be considered independent. They could, you know, maybe it's we focus on 2 of them, maybe all 3 of them, maybe just 1 of them, or maybe there's a different area. So what we have here is kind of a fixed variable and total or average costs at each group size. And I just put in some mock costs here just to make the math very simple in terms of, you know, how we discuss this. And so if anyone is, you know, not really familiar with those terms of fixed and variable costs, the idea there is that a fixed cost is something that's going to remain consistent. So you might think of that if you're having DAHAB services at a specific building, the building is still going to have the same rent, whether you're taking care of 2 individuals or 5 individuals at the same time. A variable cost, you know, we've heard some things around transportation, for example. If you are you know, only serving 2 individuals, then you have maybe a larger percentage of your time is transportation because you're not able to bill, relatively speaking, as much time during the day, or vice versa, depending on how efficient, you know, routes are, things like that. So there could be cost differences between taking care of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 individuals at the same time. So if we were to kind of total those costs up, and you can see we've got them for each group size going down, where the fixed is that $2 always. The variable is shown as $1 per individual. So we've got $1 for 1 individual, $2 for 2 individuals, et cetera. We get that total, which you could do as kind of a discrete rate. So I'll come back to that in a second. But if we look at a group size of 3, we get $5. And what's currently built in, roughly speaking, would be $5 for everybody. And so we've heard concerns around this where there are different fixed and variable costs that could you know, outweigh what's built in with those averages that kind of comes apart from it a little bit. So the intent of having this group size together, the intent originally was that individuals would either be determined to need a 2-to-1 staffing ratio, a 1-to-1 staffing ratio, a small group staffing ratio, or a large group staffing ratio. So if you take the subset of those people who need a small group staffing ratio, then they would potentially have 2 to 5 individuals per staff. And if that's the case, the intent was to incentivize serving 4 to 5 individuals and maybe disincentivize taking care of 2 individuals if they needed the same level, if they had, you know, with their PCP, if they had that same small group level of need. So that assumption is kind of baked into having one rate for small group. Another way that could be looked at here is by splitting those rates into rates for each individual group size. So you could have one rate, for example, for size 2, we have in gray there is $4, one rate for size 3, which would be $5, one rate for size 4, which would be $6. So that's one way to address this. We've heard that doing that approach may be a little bit burdensome administratively, that it may be difficult to keep track of when you have, you know, in 15-minute increments, when exactly you go from 3 in your group to 4 in your group, and then back down to 2 and then up to 5. And so, you know, that may be a little bit difficult. So that hasn't been something that has been implemented at the moment. There are also some kind of higher level administrative difficulties in terms of system processes, where these would potentially need to be new rates that are loaded into the system which adds some, some technical complexities that may take a little bit of time. One of the things that had been done in the past is based on feedback from providers, I think these components were not all being multiplied by the staffing ratio. So the impact of that is, if you have a size 1 that works out, you have $2 as your fixed and $1 as your variable. Once you start getting up to size 2, size 3, etc., you're not only getting the $2 from the first person that is receiving that service, but you're also getting $2 from the second person receiving that service. Or 3 people, you get an additional $2 from the third person receiving that service. So instead of a $2 fixed cost, you're now building $6 into the rate. And so there was that mismatch between what was built in and what was expected to be experienced. So that was something that had been done as an attempt to reconcile this, but I think it missed the mark a little bit. So we wanted to have this open discussion and see what kind of thoughts, comments, concerns people had around those fixed and variable costs.
Chris, it's Chris. First, let me say, I think that we absolutely have got to get the DAHAB rates correct. You've got multiple providers around the state right now trying to decide whether to keep their program open, how to change their program to keep it alive. So this long-term solution here is absolutely necessary. What I'm following you on this example right here is what we're now talking about is modifying or adjusting the staffing ratio that's applied to each of the levels of service. In other words, we previously had a small group 2 to 5, you're using a 0.33, large group 6 to 10, you're using a 0.17 factoring for the staffing ratio. I think what I'm hearing you say is now you're going to, if you go down this path, you may be able to tailor it to the levels a little bit more tightly. But I think we still have a foundational flaw. And I'll explain to you what I mean. If you could back up to the slide that I had the actual brick calculation on it, I would certainly appreciate it. That one right there. In either one, it really doesn't matter. When we start to look at the calculation of the brick, John from JVGA went through this many a times. We had the discussion, I would say a pretty intense one as well, about whether or not we could apply the staffing unit factoring to the entire brick. We all agreed that the staffing costs and the ERE and the training can be divided by the group size. I think where I'm stuck is that the other components of the brick, in my opinion, cannot be divided by the group size. And that right there is putting us in a position where we've got an artificially reduced fully loaded, a billable rate essentially, and then it feels like we're trying to compensate for that artificially low rate by policy adjustments or other changes, or we're trying to come up with a tighter allocation within the group size. I just, to give you an example, I mean, and I've got right here on my screen, so I took the small group and large group for DAHAB, and we've talked about transportation on multiple occasions. So the brick component within that for small group is $642 per billable unit, per fully loaded brick. When you apply and divide it by the staffing ratio on a billable day, so assume a provider is able to bill 6 hours in that day, that means for a small group, I'm going to be able to recoup $12.72 in a 6-hour time period for transportation. But when you look at it, transportation $642, but because we're dividing by the staffing unit, we're dividing the fully loaded brick by the staffing unit, we've basically torched that number. $12.72 for a 6-hour day for transportation, it's not hitting the mark. But I think the concept that transportation supports for a provider have nothing to do with the group size. The general and administrative has nothing to do with the group size. Facility has nothing to do with the group size. Programming has nothing to do with the group size. Why can we not factor in the components in the billable rate calculation for the items that should be, or the components that should be divided by the group size, divide them by the group size, and the ones that aren't, don't. We were there with, JVGA was in this position when we started, had a conversation with them, talked them out of it. I remember when Optimus first came on, we had the same conversations. We went back to this methodology, came away from it, and now we're back here again. You know, when the November rates came out and you looked at and we weren't dividing by the group size for small and large group for day add, there was some hope that the rates we might be able to get to the point where they were sufficient to do what we were trying to do. And then we've gone back again, and it's very disheartening, because the amount of money that we're talking about I mean, transportation alone, $12.72. We were getting more than that 5 years ago in a billable day. We're 5 years later, and we're supposed to be improving things, and I'm just not sure that that's meeting the mark. And you can look at it for all the components. Every component that should not be divided by the group size that you're dividing by the group size is pushing that fully loaded billable rate artificially low, and then now we're trying to compensate for it on the back end.
And Chris, this is Karen Adams-Gilchrist with Providence, and I just want to say that Chris, the other Chris, he said that perfectly, and I think we've said repeatedly that this whole model has to be relooked at, because it has such a significant impact. And when you think about program support and transportation and all of those things, and when you think about that regardless of how many people are in that group, the level of program support is required for each individual person. The level of transportation is required for each individual person. The assumptions have to be based on the practicality of how we deliver the service. And we're not picking, everybody isn't picked up, everybody that is in the group all live in the same place and get on the bus at the same time or the van at the same time. It doesn't happen that way. We're picking people up individually, and those things have to be taken into account, or it decimates how we're able to deliver this service. So I just wanted to go on the record that I'm really concerned, and I'm excited that this is going to be a priority and that we're going to figure out how to get this right, because it truly impacts how we deliver this service and how people's lives that are going to get this service. So, and thank you, Chris, for your explanation. It was perfect.
You're welcome. And again, to the team here, I just want to mention, I really think that this is one of those fundamental flaws. Not only does it affect day program, it affects community living group, it affects every service where we're attempting to factor in the group size and divide the entire brick by the group size. You can't do it.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think those are valid concerns. If we go back down to that slide for a second, I think it's one after this one. That's the idea here is, if there's a problem with being able to divide those costs by the number of individuals, then in theory, not looking at what specific components they are, anything like that, but in theory, if there is a problem with that fundamental process, then by having a rate for an entire group, 2 to 5, there is no way to get a rate that's appropriate for each of those different sizes. So the way that you would address that, in theory, is by either doing something like splitting up the rate into discrete sizes, so one for size 2, one for size 3, one for size 4, etc., or looking at something like pulling out a component, for example, transportation, and saying, we're going to pay for the rate of everything excluding transportation, and then have transportation as its own rate. So those are, at least how I'm understanding it, those are kind of the two solutions that you can go with. You'd have to do some sort of separation if you think that this must be different for each rate size. Let me know if I'm missing the mark there.
No, but Chris, I'll be honest, I think you may need to do both. I think we may need to correct the foundational component that we were just talking about, but then, if we fix that and then take a look at how the rates flow out, if the logic is still there, then maybe we don't need to. But if the logic is not there because we're trying to shove, a group size of 2 to 5 into one staffing factor, but again, we've got to decide whether or not we want to apply that staffing factor all the components of the brick. I think that's the first commitment we've got to make, is that we can't do that.
Well, and let me just jump in. I do think the idea of providers having to bill by a group size that changes by person would be pretty onerous. And people, move around, the group size may change, the transportation size may be different from the group size when somebody is, wherever in the building, out of the building, doing whatever. So, and I'm not sure that having a different rate person by group size makes sense. I think we need to find other solutions.
And Chris, can you? I may have misunderstood you, but can you explain why we can't have both variable and fixed in the rate? Did you say one or the other? I just want to make sure I understood.
Sure. Yeah. So the idea there is that the way it's currently built, if we were looking at this spreadsheet that we have here, using these mock numbers, we have essentially a $5 rate, regardless of the number of individuals there, and that serves to the purpose of, incentivizing those who can take care of individuals in a group size of 4 or 5. But it disincentivizes those who can take care of individuals in a group size of 1 or 2. And so if there is a difference and we want to directly account for that difference, like we see in the variable cost column, where it changes by individuals, then in theory, we would need to have a separate rate so that we could get to kind of what's gray there instead of what's on the far right, or we get a separate rate of $3, $4, $5, depending on the number of individuals, to be able to kind of build back to the costs that are variable there. And what we just heard from Laura is kind of what we were bringing up as well, is that seems like a good solution on paper, and it seems like that might be one of the steps, or maybe the only step that's necessary to take to address this issue. I know Chris was mentioning that that's one of 2 steps that he thinks is appropriate. But what we're hearing is, even though that may look good on paper, that may be difficult for providers to keep track of. When they have a small group rate, they could just bill the small group rate. But if they have to bill an individual rate for 1, 2, 3, 4, et cetera, people, then they'd have to keep track of, how many individuals they're serving every 15 minutes to be able to track that appropriately. So I think we're on the same page with you guys. We want to make sure we're getting this as appropriate, matching it the best we can. And we're hitting these constraints right now of, there's a difference in cost depending on the group size with those variable costs, but there's administrative burdens trying to address that. So how do we kind of move forward?
Chris, is there another option? This is Maria. If you go back to the other slide, is another option to adjust your staffing ratios. So for the day program, if we look at program support and transportation, that's about 28% of the total rate. And so, for example, a small group, with 5 people in it, that's more like a 1-to-1 staffing ratio for 28% of the time, and then the rest would be the 1-to-5. And so, could you look at it in combination with this type of approach, where you're looking at part of the costs being that fixed and part of the cost being variable, and modifying your assumption to get to an average staffing ratio? I'm just throwing that out as an option, because I agree that I think, trying to have a group of 1, 2, 3 in 15-minute increments isn't administratively or operationally feasible. Gets us to the same point.
Yeah. And we're kind of throwing out ideas here of ways that we're thinking of addressing or approaching these things, and that's why I wanted to get your feedback. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think, Scott, it looked like you had a question or a comment there.
I was just curious whether Chris Parks had any examples on how to slide some of those other costs around. I didn't know, Chris, whether you had a worksheet. Is there something that you could shoot out to the group to look at over the next week as options?
Scott, I'd have to see exactly what you're looking for, but yeah, I can certainly put something together.
But I mean, I think your point, I mean, the program coordinator, you need a program coordinator for every single person. And you can, that's almost becomes a fixed sort of thing, you know.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think when you factor out the breakdown of the brick and then the fact that you're dividing by the group size and then, you know, over what you're able to bill for the day, some of those numbers clearly are they're just not sustainable. Whether you break them down by component or not. I mean, like I said, $12 a day for transportation, and that's the highest of the ones that I'm looking at here. You know, that's a rate that's lower than where we were 5 years ago, and that's not what we're trying to get to.
So I think just with making sure we're staying on track, if we can go to the next slide for a second. This is kind of a placeholder slide for that open discussion, which, you know, we've been having along the way. I think it's really useful and helpful. But as we're looking at these options, you know, are there other types of data, other components that we should be looking at addressing? You know, how does the group feel about those three that we presented? So the transportation, the fixed versus variable costs, and the, you know, potentially having the average group size or staffing ratio adjusted based on, you know, the incoming data. And just in a larger picture, is DAHAB, you know, is this the priority that we want to focus on, given that we have a limited time to, you know, implement things before fiscal year 23 goes live? So just wanted to kind of have that open discussion. If DAHAB, if this seems like we're in the right place, which, you know, it sounds like we're hearing a lot of comments there, which, you know, hopefully we're in the right place. And then some ideas on how we think, given the options that we've presented or other options that you're considering, how we would like to address some of these changes for 23.
So this is Sharon, and I guess I have a kind of overarching question. I think, you know, based on what we've heard, DAHAB is certainly a priority, but I'm also wondering what information the department has at this point or does not have from the Hilltop templates and the potential impact that may drive a more data-driven, less anecdotal approach to determining the priorities.
Yeah, so we haven't, from the Optimus side, we haven't met with Hilltop around those impact studies yet. They have, from our understanding, they've processed some of them. They're still kind of awaiting some more information and aggregating that information. But I don't know if anyone from DDA is a little bit closer to that and may be able to provide a little bit more specific or narrow timelines there.
Yeah, excuse me. Thank you, Chris. So yes, we are meeting with Hilltop tomorrow just to discuss, you know, additional areas that we think are valuable to focus on. And so we're going to go through that with them tomorrow.
I mean, I think that's and I'll stop here, but I mean, I think that's one of the challenges. I think we have to pick something based on the very limited amount of time. I think that concerns have been expressed about DAHAB, both related to the transportation and then the fixed versus variable. If we are going to dig into it, the other piece that I would add, I guess, to the transportation is the assumptions around what is a transportation cost, because we believe, based on our prior work and prior conversations, that different providers had different interpretations of what a transportation cost is. And I think that you know, that probably, that difference in interpretation then plays out in, you know, both the assumptions as the brick gets built, but then also, you know, the assumptions that will show up in the impact analysis.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
And can I ask one other question of DDA in terms of just having all the information to be able to support all of this work? Do you have a sense of when the updated billing guidance will be available? And will that include audit standards, kind of back to the conversation around expectations related to staffing hours, or how the audit standards will be driven by the billing guidance?
Yeah, Sharon, this is Patricia. We're working on that, and we're trying to make sure that we got that clear. And from today's discussion, we're going to be adding some clarity on the dedicated hours and the flex hours. So we'll try to get that to you guys as soon as possible.
Patricia, go ahead, Laura. I'm sorry.
And say, I do think just in general, just kind of a process comment that I know I'm mindful and respectful of the fact that this is, really intended to have a lot of transparency for the public in terms of these meetings. But it's really difficult to, as a member of the group, to not really have information ahead of the meeting and then try to, take all this in and give you, kind of really critical, high-level feedback that is going to drive things. I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but I am feeling that way. And, representing a lot of providers,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Laura. I think today our goal was to try to get basic information about the brick and the components. And then we were going to be looking at, based on the feedback, we have been updating the guidance in the in the billable information, and we'll make sure we get that out. But be happy to coordinate with Carrie and the team to make sure the groups get the information ahead of time. I think today's discussion was very clearly on just make sure everybody was on the same page, and we will try to share any of the documents to support whatever the presentation that we're doing. I think what happens is such a good discussion, and then just growing, we get into problem solving and other things. But absolutely, I think you have a really good point. We'll try to make sure that you have all the information. The group here has all the information so that people can look at it ahead of time.
Well,
Anything you want to add to that?
I just think that in terms of this particular slide about identifying, the priorities, which clearly, the number have spoken about DAHAB, but, and what data would be helpful and what various analyses. I think, to Sharon's point, having feedback from the fiats seems like it would be an important component in addition to having some information ahead of time.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree.
Robert, Patricia, this is Chris. Do we have any kind of a game plan for the cost report, data collection tool, whatever you want to call it, and when providers can expect that to be implemented, and really when, the rate review advisory group, obviously we need that information moving forward. You've got a group of early adopters right now that could give you some information in the format that we're talking about moving forward to give us a comparison on the first 5 or 6 that went in. We don't launch till July 1st of this year, and I think that's probably still a good target goal. You're not going to have any data till January of 25.
I'm not sure if DDA is able to, provide a little more information there, but I'll just throw in my 2 cents that, we understand that there are going to be those timelines and delays in kind of that lag period, I should say, in the ability to collect data and make adjustments. But I think that from, what we're showing here, our perspective is in the absence of having that complete data, but there are still adjustments that can be made, still revisions and reviews that can be done on various components and aspects and methodologies with maybe more limited or specific data sets. But that's kind of our intention in the short-term period, but I don't know if DDA can respond to Chris's question a little bit more around the timeline for the cost reports or information there.
And I'm really looking to grab, real data. I mean, you've got early adopters that did an impact projection tool, and they're living it. I think it would be very beneficial to see how did their original projections, how did they stack up against reality? And then you're getting ready to send another 21 in. I just don't. We're not going to get a second chance to gather that data timely. It needs to happen ASAP.
Christian, I'll tell you that as an early adopter, and Greg is on as well, that we did talk to DDA about some of the impacts, especially of utilization going from a prospective payment to a fee for service. And I think they were very receptive to the things that we told them, the concerns that we had around specifically things like the size of the utilization, and then the size of the groups and things like that. So I think that was pretty real time. I mean, they came forth in October, November, I guess November, December with the rate tool, and we were having discussions with them by January about the impact.
Right. And Karen, you've been an early adopter all year. I mean, does it make any sense for you to take your current year financial information and put it into the old format cost report? Is there any value in that at all? Or should we be looking at using a data tool to collect?
Yes, it's due, right? And I actually was in LTSS even before that because of supported living, and we support almost 60, 70 people in supported living. And so we've been in LTSS since November of 2020. And if it doesn't work, DDA is going to find that out, because that's the format we're having to use. It's the only format there is.
And so, Chris, I just want to ask a clarifying question. Are you referring to the fiat, or are you actually talking about the cost report? The
cost report itself, the annual cost report.
Okay.
Because I mean, the other component of that, Robert, is that providers, if you're going to have a whole new reporting format, and I don't want to get stuck on this. I mean, the priority is fixing the date program, but again, we're not going to know if things are fixed if we're not collecting the data on the back end. We've got to get that data. You have early adopters, we could have that data. My understanding is, and John from JVGA talked about this, that the data collection tool would need to be a similar format so the providers could put down their expenses into the categories by the brick component. So
that's correct.
I think we need to start gathering that format now. And my other main point is that you can't come, you've got 5 early adopters you would do it to now if you launched. You can't come to a provider mid-fiscal year and say, can you change your reporting? Because they may have to make general ledger changes, structural changes. And if you do it at the end of the year, you're talking about reclassifying stuff for 12 months. It's a huge burden to go back and do it. If we're going to do it, we need to do it before the start of the fiscal year. You've got a half dozen in now. You can ready to put another 20 in. I think we need to have the data collection tool, cost report, brick report, whatever you want to call it, usable and out to providers, as soon as possible at this point in time, especially for the ones, that are going to be starting, have already started, or are going to be having a full fiscal year next year in the new LTSS system.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris, and that's a valid point, and we've already had discussions internally about that, because we know that some presentations were done back when JGVH or VA was here. I'm sorry, the acronym, tongue twisting acronym. But so we want to make sure that we're giving that same guidance, right? So that is not such of an administrative burden on providers. We know it's been a while since folks have seen that. We want to get that back out there because we know we're going to need that data refresh. So I think, the timeliness of that is important, to your point, to get that out there. I would also add that we are going to use whatever data we have available to us to help inform the decisions of this committee and the state, and we'll make sure that we're getting that information into your hands, right? So that you've had time to, I guess, do your homework before these meetings. And I think we're learning a lot about today and moving, day have services up as a priority for a possible FY23 adjustment. And so I think this has been a helpful discussion as well. It has definitely, it will definitely inform the discussion we have tomorrow with Hilltop. I just want to, so you all know that we are somewhat limited with what we can do with the fiat. As you all know, you are filling them out, especially when it comes to trying to break those services down to ascertain the difference in revenue between the two systems, because the PCIS2 revenue input was an aggregate number. But we know there's a lot of other valuable ways that we can slice and dice that information. It may require some additional analytics on our end, but we, you know, it's important. And as Chris mentioned before, we're all in this together and we all want to achieve the same outcome.
And I think that over the past 6 months, at least, maybe more, there has been a lot of work going into understanding potential issues and some of the, which is how items made it onto our proposed priority list in the first place. And obviously there does need to be a standard data collection mechanism set up as soon as possible, certainly. But in the meantime, my understanding is that the stakeholder community has also said there's urgency around making certain specific changes. So to kind of make sure we're always data informed, but respond to that feedback, that's why while we're setting up these more long-term processes, we do want to take a look at certain specific issues, analyze them, see if there are changes that are warranted. So that's how we're approaching this unusual condensed first year.
I know we're running really short on time here, so I just wanted to do a quick recap of 5 takeaways that I'm seeing so far, and let me know if there's anything else that you think we missed. The intent here would be to kind of focus on these to drive the content and the discussion of our next meeting. So one would be, we've heard that cost report or data collection tool needs to be addressed and potentially gotten out to providers as soon as possible. The next would be reviewing that provider information that we have available to look at things like the average group size or any other changes in how service is delivered for the day habilitation specifically. Also looking at some of the options with potentially splitting out rates or components against those constraints of administrative burdens. So we'd be looking at, you know, what kind of things can and can't DDA offer, and also what are potentially some solutions of, you know, taking care of both of those issues at the same time. Would welcome input, you know, in the short term, in the interim period, or at the next meeting around solutions or options there as well. The fourth thing would be getting information on transportation surveys, so sending that out to you guys to see if that is, you know, if we're asking the right questions and how feasible that would be to implement and collect data in a timely manner for fiscal year 23, or if that's something that needs to take longer. And then the fifth thing that I'm thinking of is, you know, getting feedback from all of you for fiscal year 24, which is kind of our next slide there, on what were some priorities that we really want to work on after, you know, having this short-term focus period on DayHab moving forward. Where do we want to prioritize things there? So those were kind of the 5 key areas that I was seeing as takeaways and content for next meeting. Are there any other things that we wanted to throw on there, or any other things that I may have missed?
Chris, it's Laura. I think I want to make sure we don't lose track of the flex versus dedicated hours, because that's a pretty big one.
And all the
Great,
way
yep.
back to the very beginning, we were going to get the clarification on the BLS calculations with the 9.5%.
Sure, absolutely. Trying to summarize and take notes live. I missed a couple things, so I appreciate that. So the 9.5% inflationary kind of adjustment, and that other one was the flex versus dedicated hours, getting that clarity around, you know, what seems like a gray area at the moment.
And when would the next rebasing period be, Chris? You mentioned at the very beginning, we wouldn't be rebasing. We're using calendar 18 BLS. When would we look at new BLS? Is that for fiscal 23, 24? Not on the table,
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I don't know if anyone else can support me there, but I think the intent was to do that on approximately every 2 years to look at and making adjustments at least once every 4 to 5 years. So I don't know if there's specific dates in line that DDA or anyone else can hop on for when that rebase would be.
Yeah, I don't want to shoot from the hip. We'd have to go back and look at the charter.
Right. I think the frequency of rebasing kind of is driven by two things. One is kind of federal regulations, and the other is kind of looking at the data, looking at hearing from providers, has something big changed to make us think we need to rebase. So it's some of both that would kind of determine where in the range of time we want to think about rebasing that'll actually happen.
Appreciate all the feedback and input and comments today. It's been very helpful. I know we're running past time, so hand it over to Jennifer to kind of close things out.
All right. So as you all know, these meetings are going to continue to occur monthly until September, and will be posted on DDA's training calendar. We're making minutes available following each meeting. And members of the public who would like to observe the meetings can register through DDA's training calendar. Our next meeting date is Friday, April 15th, and it's monthly through August. And the Rate Review Advisory Group has a dedicated page on the DDA website that we recommend bookmarking to access meeting minutes and the agenda. I'm going to try to put that in the chat. We'll see if I can figure that out.
Apologies, it looked like we didn't include the updated calendar. So thank you, Jennifer, confirming April 15th.
All right. So I think that's all of information we had to discuss today. So thank you everyone for your attendance and for being so engaged in this process. We really do appreciate all of the feedback, and we will see you on April 15th.